Saliva dribbled down his chin while he stared with greedy, glassy eyes, evaluating Mark's daughter, as if she were merchandise on a display shelf. The thick, viscous fluid caught in the matted tangles of the stranger's beard, glistening in the dappled sunlight of the Blue Ridge Mountains. But the man did not bother to wipe it away. He just kept drinking from the blue Nalgene bottle Mark had handed him, his Adamus apple bobbing violently with each gulp, while his gaze remained fixed, unblinking, on 15-year-old Lily. Mark stood rigid, his hand hovering inches from the small folding knife clipped to his belt. He was a mechanical engineer from Virginia, a man of logic and blueprints, but in that moment, every primitive circuit in his brain was screaming an alarm that no schematic could explain. They were 5 miles up the Appalachian Trail, nestled in a clearing that had seemed idyllic only an hour ago. Now, the golden patches of sunlight felt like spotlights in an interrogation room. Is it good? Lily asked, her voice trembling. She had moved behind Mark, using her father's torso as a shield. She was usually a firecracker, full of teenage rebellion and eye rolls, but the sudden appearance of this man had reduced her to a frightened child. The stranger lowered the bottle slowly. He did not look like a hiker. He looked like something the forest had regurgitated. He wore a faded, oversized flannel shirt that smelled of mildew and unwashed wool, and his jeans were caked in a mud that looked too dark, almost black. But it was the eyes that froze Mark's blood. They were not just crazy. They were vacant yet focused, like a shark sensing vibrations in the water. "It's sweet," the man rasped. His voice sounded like gravel grinding together. Real sweet. He was not talking about the water. He was looking right at Lilia's face, tracing the line of her jaw with his eyes. Mark felt a wave of nausea roll through him. The logical part of his brain, the part that paid taxes and held doors open for strangers, was fighting a war against a violent paternal instinct. Snatch the bottle back. Tell him to get lost. Push him. But Mark hesitated. He did not want to escalate the situation. The man looked unstable, possibly on drugs, and they were miles from help. If Mark provoked him and the man had a weapon, what then? "You said you were lost," Mark said, his voice tighter than he intended. He stepped slightly to the right, blocking the man's view of Lily completely. "The trail markers are pretty clear going south. If you head back the way you came, you'll hit the parking lot in 2 hours. The stranger smiled, revealing yellowed teeth that looked too sharp for a human mouth. "Turned around," he muttered, swaying slightly on his feet. "Everything looks different when the sun goes down. But you folks, you look prepared. Cozy." Mark's knuckles turned white. "Keep the bottle," he said abruptly. "We have enough. You should get moving before it gets dark." It was a peace offering, a bribe. Take the plastic bottle and leave us alone. It was the civilized choice, the choice of a man who believed in de-escalation. The stranger looked at the blue bottle in his hand, then back at Mark. The smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, jarring blankness. He nodded, slowly, almost mechanically. "Right, moving on." He turned, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and began to walk. But he did not head back toward the main trail. Instead, he drifted toward the dense, overgrown brush to the east of their campsite, a direction where there was no path, only deep, ancient woods. "Hey!" Mark called out against his better judgment. "The trail is behind you." The stranger paused but did not look back. He just raised a dirty hand in a wave that looked more like a spasm. "I know where I'm going," he shouted back. Mark watched him disappear into the shadows of the oaks. The silence of the forest returned, but the peace was gone. The air felt heavier, charged with static. "Dad," Lily whispered, clutching the back of his shirt. "I do not like this. Can we go?" Mark looked at the sun. It was already dipping below the ridge. Hiking down in the dark on rocky terrain was dangerous, a recipe for a twisted ankle or worse. And logically, the man was gone. He was just a confused drifter. "It'll be dark in 20 minutes, Lil," Mark said, forcing a reassuring smile that felt like a mask of plaster. We safer here than stumbling down the mountain in the pitch black. He's gone. Probably just some burnout looking for a place to crash. He was trying to convince himself as much as her. He chose to stay. He chose to trust the logic of the situation over the screaming instinct in his gut. As they turned back to their tent, Mark did not see the movement in the brush 50 yards away. He did not see the pair of eyes watching them from the darkness, no longer glassy, but sharp, calculating, and patient. The darkness in the Blue Ridge Mountains did not fall. It swallowed. By 9:00 p.m., the forest was a wall of obsidian surrounding their small, flickering campfire. Mark had let the fire die down earlier than usual, afraid that the light would act as a beacon, but the absence of light was almost worse. They retreated into the tent early. The thin nylon walls, which usually felt cozy and protective, now felt paper-thin, a fragile membrane separating them from a world that had suddenly turned hostile. Mark positioned his sleeping bag closest to the zipper, placing Lily on the far side. He did not undress. He lay on top of his sleeping bag, wearing his boots, his hand resting on the hilt of the hunting knife. "Dad!" Lily's voice was a barely audible whimper from the darkness. "I'm here, honey. Go to sleep." "Did you hear that?" "It's just the wind, Lil. Trees settling." But Mark was lying. He was wide awake, his ears straining against the ambient noise of the forest, the chirping crickets, the rustling leaves. He was waiting. Hours passed. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight pressing down on his chest. Marcus' eyes grew heavy, the adrenaline fading into exhaustion. He began to drift, the logic of the engineer taking over again. The guy was just a weirdo. He's miles away by now. Then, at 2:13 a.m., the sound began. It was not a footstep. It was a scrape. It was the sound of metal dragging against stone and hard earth. Heavy. Deliberate. Rhythmic. Marcus' eyes snapped open, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He held his breath, praying Lily would not wake up. Thump, thump, footsteps. Heavy, unhurried bootfalls. And then that dragging sound again. Someone was walking around their tent. Mark gripped the knife so hard his hand began to cramp. He lay perfectly still, visualizing the scene outside. The person was circling them. Not approaching the door, not trying to enter, just circling. Thump, thump, The sound moved from the left side of the tent to the back. It was agonizingly slow. This was not the gait of a hiker passing through. This was a patrol, a ritual. "Dad," Lily whispered, her voice tight with terror. She was awake. Mark reached out in the dark and squeezed her shoulder, a silent command for silence. "Shoo!" he hissed, the sound barely escaping his lips. The footsteps stopped, right behind Lily's head. Mark could hear the heavy, wet breathing through the nylon. It sounded congested, rattling in the intruder's chest. The smell drifted in through the mesh ventilation at the top of the tent. That same stench of wet wool, decay, and something copper-like. Mark's mind raced. If he unzipped the tent, he would be vulnerable. He would not be able to see anything in the dark. But the intruder would hear the zipper. They were trapped in a nylon coffin. He had his phone in his other hand, but the screen displayed no service. He was an engineer, a problem solver, but there was no solution here that did not involve violence he was not sure he was capable of. The dragging sound started again. It was louder now. The metal object was digging deep into the ground. The intruder completed one full circle, then started a second. Why is not he attacking? Mark thought, sweat stinging his eyes. What is he doing? The psychological weight of it was crushing. The stranger was toying with them. He knew they were awake. He knew they were terrified. He was savoring their fear like a fine wine. Every scrape of the metal was a reminder. I am here. You are there. And you can do nothing. Mark imagined bursting out of the tent, knife raised. But the image was followed by another. Him stumbling in the dark, the stranger waiting with a weapon of his own, Lily screaming. The fear of failure, of making the wrong move and getting his daughter killed, paralyzed him. So he did the only thing he could do. He lay there, clutching his daughter's hand, tears of impotent rage and terror leaking from his eyes, listening to the metal carve a line in the earth. The sound continued for 20 minutes. 20 minutes that felt like 20 years. And then, abruptly, it stopped. Silence rushed back into the clearing, deafening and sudden. Mark did not move. He did not sleep. He lay there, knife in hand, waiting for the zipper to tear open, waiting for the end. But the end did not come. Just the silence, heavy and mocking. The first gray light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric, bringing with it a cold, damp reality. Mark had not slept a wink. His body was stiff, locked in a state of hypervigilance, but the forest outside was quiet. The birds were singing as if the night had not happened. "Dad?" Lily asked. She looked pale, dark circles under her eyes. She had not slept either. "Stay here," Mark commanded, his voice hoarse. He unzipped the tent slowly, the sound tearing through the morning quiet like a gunshot. He pushed the flap aside and scrambled out, knife raised, ready to fight. The clearing was empty. The morning mist clung to the towering oaks, peaceful and serene. But when Mark looked down at the ground, the blood drained from his face. Surrounding their tent, forming a perfect, unbroken circle about 5 feet from the walls, was a trench. It was not just a scratch. Someone had used a heavy tool, a crowbar or a pickaxe, to gouge a 6-inch deep furrow into the hard-packed earth. The dirt was piled neatly on the outside of the ring. It looked like a ritual circle, a barrier, or a target. Mark stepped over the trench, his legs trembling. He walked toward the edge of the clearing where the man had disappeared the night before. "Dad!" Lily screamed from the tent. Mark spun around. Lily was pointing at the ground near the fire pit. There, pressed into the mud, were boot prints. But not just random prints. The stranger had stood there, facing the tent. At his feet lay a pile of cigarette butts, arranged in a neat little pyramid. He had stood there for a long time, smoking and watching them sleep before he started digging. "Pack the car," Mark said, his voice unrecognizable. "Now, leave the tent. Leave everything else. Just get in the car." They ran. They did not hike. They practically sprinted down the trail, abandoning hundreds of dollars of camping gear. Mark kept looking over his shoulder, expecting to see that flannel shirt, those glassy eyes, emerging from every shadow. Every snapping twig sounded like the scrape of metal. They reached the Ford Explorer in record time. Mark fumbled with the keys, dropping them in the dirt, cursing, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the fob. When the engine finally roared to life, he tore out of the parking lot, tires screeching, not slowing down until they were 10 miles down the winding mountain road. An hour later, they were sitting in the fluorescent-lit office of the Millerville State Police. The station smelled of stale coffee and floor wax, a stark, comforting contrast to the smell of the woods. Sergeant Williams, a thick-set man with a graying mustache, listened to their story without interrupting. He took notes on a yellow pad, his expression hardening as Mark described the stranger. "Average height," Mark said, his voice still shaking. "Green flannel. Smelled terrible. And he had these eyes, glassy, like he was looking through us." Williams stopped writing. He opened a drawer and pulled out a file folder. He flipped through it for a moment before sliding a photograph across the desk. "Is this the shirt?" Williams asked. Mark looked at the photo. It was a picture of a man, smiling, standing on a mountain peak. He was wearing bright, clean hiking gear. But underneath his windbreaker, he was wearing a green flannel shirt. "That's the shirt," Mark said, confused. "But that's not the guy. The guy we saw was older, rougher, dirtier." William sighed, a heavy, tired sound. "Mr. Thompson, this photo is of Kevin Turner. He went missing in the Blue Ridge 3 days ago. We found his body yesterday evening, about 4 miles north of your campsite." Mark felt the room spin. "His body. He was stripped," Williams said grimly. "Whoever killed him took his clothes, his boots, his pack. Mark gripped the edge of the desk. The nausea returned, violent and overwhelming. So the man we saw was wearing a dead man's clothes? Williams finished. You encountered the suspect we've been hunting. We call him the Drifter. We do not have a name yet. Mark looked at Lily. She was staring at the floor, hugging herself. They had been talking to a murderer. They had given him water. He dug a trench around us, Mark said. A circle. Why? Why did not he just attack us? Williams leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. We've seen the circles before. At 2 other campsites where people went missing last month. We thought it was some kind of occult nonsense. But we could not figure out why he digs them. It seemed like a victory. They had survived. They had identified the killer. They were safe in a police station. But the true horror was waiting in the logic of the events. Mark sat in the plastic chair, his mind racing, replaying the night. The scraping. The waiting. The circle. Why did he dig the circle? Williams was talking on the phone now, coordinating a search team. Yeah, near the Appalachian split. Look for a circular trench. That S his signature. Mark closed his eyes. He thought about the stranger's face. The saliva. The way he looked at Lily. Greedy. Evaluating. He looked at her like she was merchandise. Mark whispered to himself. The memory of the specific phrase he had used in his head. Merchandise. Shifted. Not merchandise, Mark realized. Produce. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The scraping was not a threat. It was not a ritual to summon demons. Sergeant, Mark said, interrupting the officer. His voice was dead calm, the calm of absolute, horrifying clarity. The trench. It was deep, right? 6 inches? Williams looked up, annoyed. Yeah, about that. Why? And the dirt? Mark continued, his eyes wide. He piled it on the outside of the ring. Sure. What's your point? It is a larder, Mark said. The word tasted like bile. A what? I'm an engineer, but my grandfather was a farmer, Mark said, speaking rapidly now. When you want to keep root vegetables fresh in the winter or meat, you dig a trench around the storage pile. Keeps the groundwater out. Keeps the insects away. You mark the area for preservation. Williams stared at him. The room went silent. He was not trapping us, Mark said, his voice trembling. He was claiming us. He did not kill us last night because he had just eaten. He was wearing that hiker's clothes. He had just finished with him. Mark stood up, his legs feeling like jelly. The image of the saliva dripping down the man's beard returned, but now it made terrifying sense. It was not drool from madness. It was the physiological reaction to food. He was full, Mark choked out. He dug the trench to mark his pantry for the next night. He was saving us for later. The sergeant's phone beeped, but he did not answer it. He just stared at Mark, the color draining from his face as the implication sank in. The hungry look the stranger had given Lily was not sexual. It was culinary. He had not been evaluating her beauty. He had been evaluating her caloric value. He had touched the Nalgene bottle with freezing cold hands because his circulation was poor, a symptom of malnutrition or perhaps the slowed metabolism of a predator in hibernation. Mark grabbed Lilia's hand, pulling her up from the chair. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of the mountains, out of the state. We leaving, Mark said. We'll catch him, Williams said, but his voice lacked conviction. Now that we know the location. You do not understand, Mark said, pausing at the door. He looked back at the officer, his eyes haunted. We did not escape because we were smart. We did not escape because we were lucky. Mark thought about the polite conversation, the water bottle, the lie about leaving in the morning. We escaped, Mark whispered, because we left before he got hungry again. He pushed the door open and walked out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the parking lot. He squeezed Lilia's hand so tight it hurt, desperate to feel the warmth of her living skin, knowing that in the dark, cold logic of the woods, They had been nothing more than leftovers waiting to be consumed.